So a day like this reminds us of the importance of messages and messengers. If you open up your calendar app this morning, you probably saw that it wasn't just Father's Day, but it's also a holiday called Juneteenth, June the 19th. And so if you didn't have time this morning to do a quick Wikipedia scan on the meaning of Juneteenth, let me just catch us up to speed a little bit. On June 19th, 1865, Major General Gordon Granger of the Union Army, seen here excelling in no-shave November, he issued General Order Number 3 to plantation owners in Galveston, Texas, which, to many historians' best estimates, represented the last group of emancipated slaves to hear the good news that legally they were free. Now, with those in the room who have a quick historical fact retrieval skills as part of their spiritual gifts, you would notice that this is a troubling date for many reasons. Yes, it was 3.5 years after the Confiscation Act of 1862. Yes, it was nearly 2.5 years after Lincoln's first draft of the Emancipation Proclamation. Yes, this is 1 year after the Senate passed the 13th Amendment, allowing the prohibiting of slaves and involuntary servitude in all 50 United States. And yes, it was nearly 3 months after General Lee surrendered at Appomattox, Virginia, at the end of the Civil War. So the question is, why did it take so long for such good news to travel to people to discover that they were legally free? According to historian Henry Louis Gates Jr., a historian on this matter, he said emancipation eluded nearly 250,000 slaves in Texas because, quote, on plantations, masters had to decide when and how to announce the news, or to wait until a government agent arrived and forced them to. And it was not uncommon for them to wait until after the harvest before they conveyed the good news. So just to put all this matter in perspective, important news was delayed because the messengers did not feel obligated to do so unless they were forced to do so. This is just another way to look at communication theory that we all know well. Communication scholars remind us that messages and messengers are intricately linked. Or to put it another way, the medium is also the message. And you and I know that when a message is conveyed with passion and authority and with empathy, that it lands, that the audience responds, that they hear it clearly. But when a messenger is reluctant to convey a message, unless they're obligated to do so, it doesn't have that great of an effect. The passage that we're going to cover in Hebrews this morning as we continue on our summer-long study of the book of Hebrews from the New Testament, the central idea talks about a central message, not just for the first hearers of the book of Hebrews, but also for modern believers today. Ultimately, it reveals the character of God, the attributes of God, who is the messenger of this good news. So go to Hebrews chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, and we get the first warning that happens in the letter. There's several warnings in the letter, but this is the first one that the writer conveys to their audience. It says this: "We must pay most careful attention, therefore, to what we have heard, so that we do not drift away. For since the message spoken through angels was binding, and every violation and disobedience received its just punishment, how shall we escape if we ignore so great a salvation? This salvation, which was first announced by the Lord, was confirmed to us by those who heard him. God testified to it by signs and wonders and various miracles, and by gifts of the Holy Spirit distributed according to his will." To get to the heart of these verses, we have to first unearth who is we when the writer says we must pay most careful attention. New Testament scholars N.T. Wright and Mike Bird, they try to distill from the details of Hebrews the audience in which this letter is written to. Here's a couple of their high points. They're second-generation believers. They've always known this faith. They were baptized. At one point in their life, they said publicly they wanted to be a follower of Jesus. They were fully instructed. They received their diploma. They know all the doctrines of the church. Some of them are teachers. Early in the first couple generations of the church, they didn't have paid pastors on staff, and so they would have to rely on teachers who would come into city limits This wasn't the case for the audience of Hebrews. They actually had teachers among them. But they were also, according to the writer, infants in their faith after all of these gifts, still young in their faith. They were in the midst of a crisis of some sort. They were growing lax in meeting together, just getting together occasionally. And this is an interesting point. They were not totally fallen away. Like, how do you know if you're like not totally fallen away, but just kind of halfway fallen away? Who knows? But they had a previous vibrant faith. But the writer could not say in conclusion that they had a vibrant faith today. So you put all these things together. It seems like Hebrews is addressing some threats. Some of those threats are external. They're probably experiencing some malalignment with pressure from the outside, maybe even some low-grade suffering for being Christians in their city. But the bigger threat was internal, it seems. There was threats because some people used to attend church and be Christians with them have wandered away from the faith and they're heartbroken because of it. But perhaps the most significant threat is that it seems like across the board in this church, there is a loss of a focus on the aims of the Christian faith. Therefore, the threat of drifting away. That's why the writer says we got to pay close attention because you're drifting away from your original commitments. And he says, pay attention to the word of Jesus because there's been many messages out there and messages from God. In fact, there's been messages from angels, but Hebrews 2 says Jesus' message is even greater than the angels because ultimately, as it says in verse 3, his message leads to such a great salvation. Now that's a big idea in the Christian world, a great salvation. What exactly do we mean by that? I think the rest of the verses of Hebrews chapter 2 get to the bottom of what some of the contours are of this great salvation. I'm going to cover 3 of them in turn for the rest of our time together. The first one is that Jesus is Lord. Not just a Savior, but He's Lord. The Bible's big idea about humanity is not that we're enfleshed souls, given some decades of life, trying to figure out what it means to have a disembodied heaven eternal experience before we die. That's not the main message. That's not the message of the Bible about humans. The message of the Bible about humans is that we're created in God's image and God's likeness. That we're His image bearers and we're reflecting God's glory into the world that He loves and that He created, and that we're bringing praise to God and allowing and working with God so that there could be a flourishing in this world that He loved and that He created. But the message of the Bible is clear. Humans chose sin. And that image-bearing likeness within us has been marred beyond comprehension, beyond repair. What we need, the Bible says, is an intervention, but not just an intervention, but an intermediary. Hebrews chapter 2 tells us that Jesus is this intermediary, and there's a couple of different things about it. It says in verse 8 that everything is underneath Him because He is the Lord. But He also suffered death, it says in verse 9, in order that He tastes death for everyone, it says in verse 9. And then Jesus was made the pioneer of our salvation. Jesus is our help, and He is the Lord. The result of Jesus' sacrifice wasn't just so individuals could have a clean slate with God, and then afterwards, go do what we like. The message of the Bible is clear. God's creation project is looking for image-bearing creatures again. To announce the good news to the ends of the earth that Jesus is Lord, and then to renounce those things which don't belong in the world any longer because the world now has a new king. If your gospel doesn't include the appeal to make a difference in the world around us, then that gospel is not big enough to be Jesus' gospel. The resurrection, which is the very center of the Christian faith, is not just some neat miracle that God does at one point in history. But the first century audience would have been aware that any message of resurrection was something quite significant. Whoever is the beneficiary of that resurrection, that vindication from God, according to the ancient scriptures, is now installed as the Lord of the world. He has the controls of the heavens and the earth. He's the one in charge. And in this time and space universe, not just something in the far beyond. Which is why most of the world stumbled over this confession. Because why would God ascribe this title to someone so unimpressive, like a Galilean from the town of Nazareth? But God was making a message clear. He's rescuing the world from the very mess of it, from the lowest parts of it. The portal of God's entry into his world isn't in the most impressive places, but it's also in the very humble, in the very common places. Therefore, it reorders everything about what we expect in life. This is why Karl Barth suggested that Christian faithfulness looks like having a Bible in one hand and a newspaper in the other. And the reason that we don't see folks on mission and drifting away from this message of God is because they tend to have one without the other. But in Karl Barth's mind, if you had both, then you have the 20/20 vision of what God is doing in the world around us. So in order to prevent our drifting away from this great salvation, we need to retrieve the idea that we're image-bearing creatures of God, that God sends out into the world so that we can make a difference from within it. Which leads to the second point, is that God's people are a community. Here's the point. There are no Lone Ranger Christians in this story. We can't gain salvation personally, privately from God, and then kind of just have it as a hobby and then do the rest as what we please. But what we see again and again is that when people embrace Christ, they also embrace the community of Christ. Notice the language that Hebrews uses about our new status with God. It says in verses 10, 11, 14, and 15, "In bringing many sons and daughters to glory, Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters. He, Jesus, too, shared in their humanity so that he might free those who all their lives were held in slavery by the fear of death." Here's the point. Jesus' message draws people together to a deeper unity, a deeper communion than sports teams affiliation, political affiliation, whether you put the toilet paper off the wall or down the wall, it doesn't matter. We're called to go deeper and together. One cannot find a solution from sin from Jesus if they are unwilling to be associated with the rest of the people of God. Other New Testament writers make the same point, and perhaps as you're listening to this point about the great salvation, you think about what Paul says in Galatians chapter 5, verse 22. He gives 9 markers of what it means to be a Christian. Earlier in Galatians, Paul just said, it's not based on your nationality or your slave or free status that you claim to be a person of God. But people from all nations are becoming Christians, and so it begs the question, how can we know who is in and who's out in the Christian faith? Well, Paul gives us 9 markers. You probably memorized them, but it's worth looking at them again in Galatians chapter 5. He says, "But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control." Some of the seekers in the room are like, oh, these are the things that Christians are supposed to be best known for. But look at this list again. You and I can't do any of these virtues. We can't have any of these attributes about us without another person in the room. We can only grow in these in community. You can't grow in forbearance without someone who's quite irritable in your life that you have to have patience with. You can't just show kindness to yourself. You show kindness to a person who you might disagree on a few things, but you transcend those things that you disagree with in order to show kindness to them even in the midst of their difference. So once again, we embrace the salvation, we're drawn together. To imagine a Christian life without community is nonsensical. Rejecting the community will cause someone to drift. And that was one of the admonitions from the writer of the book of Hebrews. We get to the third thing, the third point about this great salvation. It's God's power for life today. Hebrews 2 ends with an assurance of God's continual help in our lives as believers. After proclaiming the humanity of Jesus, his willingness to be made like them and human in every way, Hebrews also says that Jesus ministers among us currently as a merciful and faithful high priest. This high priest's duty wasn't just his atoning work on the cross in the past, but Hebrews is clear, but also allowing Jesus to help those who are being tempted today. Christian brother or sister, we need to hear this morning. You and I need help today. We're not out of the shadow of vulnerability, but we need to be drawing closer to Christ and to lean upon his supporting work in our lives. And this is not because the Christian life is so flimsy that it needs to be updated periodically like our phones do. but because there are 1,000 other voices offering us cheaper good news, false promises out there that we need to be steered away from. The writer of Hebrews is clear about this. All those other voices, all those other supposed good news, it's all a long con. It will lead us into being ensnared in some way or another. It ultimately won't lead us to a place of freedom. But the good news this morning is that Jesus is here to help us. Towards the end of the letter to the Hebrews in chapter 12, the writer comes to the crescendo of the sermon in Hebrews. And the writer says that we need to run with endurance the race that is set before us. When you and I hear the term endurance, we think of a marathon runner who, mile 17, mile 18, experiences a great fatigue called the wall, and the legs feel like they're lead pipes, and there's burning in the lungs, and there's 1,000 different thoughts to just give up and to quit. 17 miles is not that bad for a day's run. But they continue to move forward because there's a greater promise if they can press through the hardship and go all the way to the end. And that's the heart of the gospel, is to push all the way to the end. This theme of endurance is always ever present in the New Testament, book after book, letter after letter. And it comes to its climax in the book of Revelation, the very last book of the Bible. If you're familiar with the book of Revelation, you know that in chapters 2 and 3, there's different letters sent to 7 different churches. Different locations, different issues, different topics, but they all end with the same command: to be victorious, to go all the way to the end. Don't just have a momentary appreciation for what Jesus has done on the cross for you and then go on to other different things in life, but to embrace it as something central and to intend to go all the way to the end. And once you get to the end, then there's a victorious prize for those who endure all the way to the end. Here's the point. Unfortunately, the American church has tried to make it so easy, not causing people to turn away, that we've raised the bar, we've lowered the bar so low, where people can just have an appreciation, be a fan of Jesus, but not be committed to Jesus and going all the way to the end with their faith journey. Dietrich Bonhoeffer called this idea cheap grace. Having some sort of an entitlement posture that can absorb this promise of forgiveness of sins, but never have the intention of going deeper in the faith and all the way to the end. Bonhoeffer would say, resist this cheap grace, demand more, experience more in your Christian faith, live to the depth of this faith, experience the total freedom of this faith, because this is why he says it. This grace that you and I have received, it cost God his only Son. It cost him deeply. There is no cheap grace in Christianity. It's costly grace. And it works in our lives all the way to the end. Until we're the finished product that God desires. This idea reminds me of an important piece of abolitionist literature that we find. It's a letter correspondence between Jordan Anderson, an emancipated slave, and to his former slave owner, Colonel Patrick Anderson. Anderson was on the Confederate side of the Civil War, but he also owned a 1,000-acre plantation in Big Spring, Tennessee. After slavery was ended and the emancipation of slaves happened, he was preparing for another harvest season, and his plantation was faltering because he didn't have any help. So he wrote a letter to Jordan asking if he would be willing to come back and to help him to get through the harvest season because his plantation was on the brink of ruin. Jordan's response is a treasure. He reminded Patrick that he and his wife worked for him for a combined 52 years without ever being paid. He reminded his former slave owner that his former slave owner shot at him a couple of different times, that his daughters were mistreated by their masters, and he lists several other offenses. Jordan demanded redress for the wages that they earned without pay over those years, and he said in his letter it would be, quote, some proof that you were disposed to treat us justly and kindly. But Jordan must have known the facade of all of it, because in the waning stanza of his letter, this is what he said: I'd rather stay here and starve and die then return to the conditions that they were exposed to while under slavery on Anderson's plantation. Highlighting Jordan's story and reflecting on Juneteenth, it gives us a window into a frame of reference of a great truth expressed in the New Testament. It's said clearly in Galatians chapter 5. It's also hinted at in Hebrews chapter 2. It is for freedom that Christ has set you free. Do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. You've been set free. Don't go back. Keep moving forward. Recognize the gift of this great salvation and demand to live into the depths of it. Cut ties with lesser loves that can't promise you what Jesus promised you. Run with endurance the race that is set before you. You've heard the message. Respond to it. Claim its benefits and live in its freedom. But don't just take Hebrews chapter 2, its word for it. Don't just take my own words for it. Listen to a church member in his words. Ryan Kelly. He's going to share his story about how he came to know such a great salvation and how he's enduring within it. Let's take in his story together.
So I'm Ryan Kelly. I've been going to Ridgepoint for about 20 years. So I grew up in a pretty rough home, but church really wasn't a part of our culture, our family norms. We didn't really know about Jesus or who he was. But I started attending a senior year in high school. I got invited to youth group. A lot of soccer guys on my team started having faith conversations. And long story short, I ended up going to Tabor to play soccer. And I didn't have someone pray with me. I didn't have just one specific moment. But I remember coming back as a sophomore and thinking, there's something special about, I thought it was that place or just that community. And a lot of people who were there they seemed like they had a sense of peace about them and some joy that I just didn't have in my life. And trying to connect the dots, it was obvious that they were Christians, they had Jesus. And it was the missing thing that I didn't have that was real attractive for me. And I wanted that peace in my life. And I felt for the first time that I kind of had a home, or I was home. And it wasn't the place, it wasn't the dormitory, it was, I was home here. I had a relationship with God that I was starting and forming and beginning to nurture. And in the last 20 years since that moment being one of them, I've had probably 4 or 5 handful of really big moments in my life that were so overwhelmingly obvious that God had his hand in those moments. And I think sometimes as Christians, with culture, with normal just pressure of living, a lot of times we forget those big moments. We forget that time where you first connected to Jesus, or you forget that time where you were at rock bottom and there's nothing with your own ability or understanding that you could do to change the outcome, and you completely leaned in. I guess that's something I've been really thinking about a lot lately, probably the last 4 or 5 years, is trying to have that perspective of knowing that I've been close to God, really close at certain times in my life, and then the daily grind of whatever it is, the busyness or the things you're trying to fight, sin, whatever, it pulls us away from God. So I wish we would remember more of what we have seen Jesus do and what we know he has done. And remember what it was like as a Christian to fall in love with Jesus for the first time.